Hello there, welcome back to the channel, and today we're discussing the Mazarite ship. This was a type of alien vessel used by a race called the Mazarites, not to be confused by them with the Mazar, who are a completely different alien race with a fairly similar sounding name. The Mazarite ships were in use around the 2150s, possibly earlier, very likely later, and they were encountered first by Starfleet in 2152 when the NX-01 Starship Enterprise was ordered by Starfleet to redirect to the Mazarite homeworld to pick up a Vulcan ambassador who had been kicked out of her position for apparently breaking the law. This all turned out to be a cover for the fact that she needed to get off world quickly and urgently and not get herself assassinated by the people she was actually going to speak in court against. And these people would like her to basically not do that, and they thought if she was discredited it would mean she either wouldn't be called to testify or that perhaps her testimony would be not considered legitimate. This turned out to be not the case, as after the NX-01 picked her up and had left Mazarite territory, it was initially intercepted by one of these starships who asked the Enterprise to hand her over so they could return her to the homeworld for further questioning. Without instructions from either Starfleet or the Vulcan High Command on this issue, Captain Archer justly refused their polite request, and upon immediately his refusal, they opened fire. Now, of course, Archer and humans in general don't take kindly to being fired upon, so they returned fire. One thing we learned during this exchange, and we will get to more details about the ship in and of itself, is that a Mazarite vessel, despite being smaller than NX class, was roughly a comparable match, although it did seem that the Mazarites were not willing to risk their starship in a one-on-one fight. The NX-01 may have had a slight edge in firepower and capability. There is no demonstrated use of torpedoes by the Mazarites. They possibly had the technology. Maybe this was not a pure combat vessel and simply didn't carry them. It only used directed energy weapons against the Enterprise, fired from the port and starboard extremes of the vessel. It likely had additional armaments, but these are the primary ones we saw fired. It was able to be damaged in a single engagement just by the aft phase cannon of the NX-01, and Archer wasn't really trying. So my feeling is, although the ships are fairly evenly matched, the Enterprise has a slight edge in gunnery, or at least in this instance. It could also be that the Mazarite captain again was simply not willing to risk his ship. What do you think? If you've seen this engagement, what do you think? Were the Mazarites just cowards, or were they actually capable of engaging and they just didn't want to risk their ship because they weren't quite strong enough? But we do see that 3 of these vessels were easily able to overwhelm the NX-01 and bring it to heel. That's not exactly surprising. Again, no torpedoes with energy weapons, and they did have some limited shields. The maximum speed of the vessel isn't entirely known, but they weren't able to sustain a much higher cruise velocity than the Enterprise. The Enterprise was able to reach about warp 5, and although the Mazarite ships were still able to gain on it, they were venting drive plasma in order to maintain the coolant levels of their engines and stop them overloading. This was happening at a greatly accelerated rate versus Enterprise. But the max speed of the Mazarite ships was, however, greater, and they were able to intercept. And at this point, Enterprise was simply not able to challenge that and had to drop out of warp to engage them properly. We then see that a Vulcan combat cruiser is easily able to overwhelm all 3 Mazarite ships. And even though they probably saw it coming, a Vulcan combat cruiser is a very formidable ship in this time period, and the Mazarites are simply no match for it. So, a bit of extended data on this ship. Again, with the Vulcan confidence of we will destroy all 3 of your ships unless they turn over the weapons to you, because the Mazarites had boarded Enterprise and were holding Archer at gunpoint. They handed over the weapons knowing that all 3 of their ships were no match on the Vulcan combat cruiser. Whether Enterprise was there or not was pretty much irrelevant. So they were going to get their asses handed to them, and they full well knew it. Now, again, we don't know the full capabilities of these ships. In brief, though, warp impulse capable, certainly had shields, had directed energy weapons. No evidence that they had transporter technology or any of the other more exotic technologies. The Mazarites themselves were a humanoid species, fairly similar in appearance to humans, but did have some additional markings on the sides of their heads. but otherwise were fairly comparable to humans in physical stature and build. Their culture seemed to be one that was mostly diplomatic, but they had strong ties to Vulcan, but similar to Earth, there were many disgruntled factions within their society that were not happy with this arrangement. And an observation made by the Starfleet crew was that the Mazarites needed to work on their social structure. I am paraphrasing, of course, but the observations from orbit was that the Mazarite cities were quite affluent, but there was just as many people living outside of them in what appeared to be slums and squalor as there were people living a decent life. In other words, the disparity between the rich and the poor, the haves and the have-nots, was great, and very likely reflected in many other aspects of their culture. Basically, it seems that a capitalist-style society in bed with the Vulcans, getting rich off the trade and the exploitation of their own people, would seem to be the likely cultural dynamic we're looking at. However, it is hard to say. There are many other possibilities, but as their society seemed to be quite driven that way, and money, wealth, and power seemed to be very important to them, and they did have a democracy, it's plausible. But what do you guys think about the Mazarites, basically? That's what we know about them in total. The actual Mazarite ship, though, is interesting. There are several other vessels we see in canon that are very similar. The Illyrian starship encountered in The Expanse was a near identical design with only slight changes and a color palette difference. Was not as powerful, and Enterprise was easily able to overwhelm that ship, but apparently the Illyrians and the Mazarites share a common design. There is also, coming out of universe now, another race who used the same ship, and that will be the Romulans, but not exactly. If you were to take the Mazarite ship and a Romulan Diderotix class warbird and put them side by side on a dorsal view, you might notice some similarities, and that's because to make this ship, they took a Diderotix class warbird, the model for it, cut off the bottom section and the beak bit, modified the ends to get rid of the nacelles, and just used the top portion of the ship for both the Illyrian vessel and the Mazarite ship. That said, they did that digitally, not in a physical practical model, but that's why the design looks so similar. It's actually a Romulan design created in 1980s for Star Trek The Next Generation. And I just find that fact quite interesting. It's another example of Star Trek doing what Star Trek does and doing a bit of light kit bashing. This is another one of those background ships we don't really see anything more of in Enterprise or any other series, but it is a vessel that I personally found quite interesting. And it also showcases that although Starfleet and humanity was often shown to be not ready, or said to be not ready to be out there, they were more than capable of handling themselves against allegedly more experienced and more advanced cultures, including those also aligned with the Vulcans, also implying that pre-Federation, just being allied with the Vulcans was not a big happy alliance. The Mazarites and the humans seem to have a very similar trade deal and negotiated peace with the Vulcans, yet they were not aware of one another and had very little, if any, interactions. But that is the Mazarite ship. We saw very little of its interior aside from a few bridge shots, which appeared to unrealistically just show the captain sat in a chair and it was lit. That's pretty much it. Again, in universe, there isn't a great deal we know about Mazarite vessels, as Starfleet's interaction with them was limited, and we, as the observers, only really see what Starfleet sees on this one. But let me know what you think of these vessels in the comment section down below. Did you know that they were just a kit-bashed Romulan warbird? And do you have any in-universe explanations as to why this ship may have actually shared a design philosophy with the Illyrians? Let me know in the comment section down below. And if you made it all to the video, thank you for watching. Bye-bye. Quick little bonus add-on here. Thinking of how the Mazarite warship was basically a kit-bashed Romulan vessel, I noted that they didn't have transporters, so when they boarded Enterprise, they used a shuttle. That shuttle docked at the side of the ship, and as you can see, it actually bears a striking resemblance to a human shuttle. I'm not saying there's any design overlap, as I say the Mazarites and the humans did not know one another, but it is another example of a little bit of cross-pollination of design we see across the Alpha Quadrant.